What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video. In this video I'm going to be discussing a very interesting format which I call Jar format, which is basically the format that takes place after Tournament Pack 2 releases. So it uses the same limited list that Treasure format did, so a lot of the decks and cards are going to be similar to those in Treasure format. So if you haven't seen my Treasure format guide, then, definitely check that out before watching this one, or just watch some of my Treasure videos in general, so that way you have a general idea of what this format looks like. But the introduction of Tournament Pack 2 actually changed a fair bit in this format in very interesting ways, and the main reason why is through this game-warpingly strong card, Morphing Jar. Now, before I dive into exactly how Morphing Jar warps the format, if you're not already subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe. We're trying to reach 500 subscribers by the end of February, which maybe at this point is not the most realistic goal, given that there aren't too many days left in February, and we're only at around 425 subscribers or so. But I'd still like to hit that goal if I can, and if you're subscribed, you'll be notified whenever I release a new video. So definitely subscribe, and also if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below. In addition, we have a Discord server, link will be in the description down below, but it's a great place to play both Jar format and any of the other formats that I've covered on my channel. So if you're interested in testing this one out, definitely check that out. But now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's discuss Jar format. Now before I dive into how Morphing Jar changes things, just to make sure we're all on the same page, Jar format is a format that uses a card pool up to Tournament Pack 2, which means that it uses the cards from Magic Ruler, Metal Raiders, Legend of Blue Eyes, the Starter Decks Yugi and Kaiba, and both tournament packs. In addition, it uses the October 2002 limited list. So let's quickly show what that list looks like. So the limited list here is the same as the one used for Treasure format. In terms of the limits, the only monsters limited are the pieces of Exodia and a Cyber Jar to curb like mill strategies and make it so that there's less sort of degenerate board wipes in the format. For these spells, we've got the original Power 5 limited spells from Yugi Kaiba, Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki, as well as the 3 hand rips, Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and Forceful Sentry. Painful choice, just to reduce deck consistency. And Snatch Deal, because this card can make for some major offensive pushes, and it can be quite annoying to deal with. Lastly, for the limited spells, we've got Upstart Goblin, which is, I believe, just to make sure that the decks can't be playing basically 37 card decks, as, being able to play 3 Upstart Goblin is pretty powerful. And for the only trap on the list, we've got Mirrored Force limited to 1 copy. For the semi-limits, both Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest are semi-limited because they're very, very good at replacing themselves from the deck, so they can be very annoying to deal with. Card Destruction's limited to limit the power of mill a little bit. Heavy Storm is semi-limited because, it's just a powerful board wipe in terms of spell and traps, so it's probably best that this card is at 2 copies. And lastly, Swords of Revealing Light is semi-limited, as this card can really stall the game out a bit. Even though there's a bit more spell and trap removal now that Magic Ruler's come and gone, this card is still very annoying in the right circumstances. So this card's limited to 2 to hamper stall decks a little bit. But, there's nothing really new here. This is the same as it was in Treasure format. So let's dive into the new stuff in Tournament Pack 2. So as I mentioned before, the main card from Tournament Pack 2 that warps the format is Morphing Jar. Morphing Jar is a flip monster that says both players discard as many cards as possible from their hand, and then each player draws 5 cards. This is insanely powerful in the mill deck, and it does enable the mill deck in this format to become something approaching the empty jar deck that would appear in later formats, which is an extremely powerful combo deck that basically uses things like Morphing Jar and Cyber Jar and Card Destruction to deck out your opponent very easily. The deck's not quite at that level yet, but it is extremely good with Morphing Jar's inclusion, and it is one of the best decks in the format in my opinion. However, surprisingly enough, it actually might not be the best deck of the format, and I'll discuss why in a little bit. But before I do, I want to discuss just the other interesting cards that Tournament Pack 2 introduced to the format that may not be as meta-defining as Morphing Jar, but are still interesting to talk about. So for the monsters, we've got Dragon Seeker, which is a frankly awful card. It basically reads that when it's normal summoned or flip summoned, you destroy one face-up dragon type monster on the field. Now this effect does target, so this means that if your opponent is playing a dragon sort of strategy, then if they've got Lord of D out, this card is basically useless. So I don't really think it's that good. I guess it's got pretty good defense at 2100, but I don't really think it's worth playing. It's a very interesting card though. Tournament Pack 2 also introduced a new tool for the Umi strategy in Giant Red Sea Snake. Now I'm not really sure if the Umi strategy is that good. You know, I guess it does have some interesting anti-synergy with Mechanical Chaser, which a lot of decks are playing now. So, you know, this is another 1800 beater for that Umi deck if they want to go that route, but I don't really think that deck is that good in this format. It is an interesting card to mention, though. The set also introduced 2 ritual monsters that are new. It introduced Skull Guardian and Dokuro Rider. Now, Dokuro Rider is basically a hard downgrade from both Hungry Burger and Performance of Sword, which are 2 level 6 ritual monsters that just have straight better stats than Dokuro Rider does. So I don't really think that there's any reason to really play this unless you want to do like a Pumpkin ritual deck, because Dokuro Rider is a zombie. But, you know, I don't really think this card is that good or worth talking about. It is interesting, though. The ritual monster that actually is a bit unique is Skull Guardian. Now, this can be brought out with Novox's Prayer, and what makes this card unique is that it's a level 7 ritual monster. Now, its stats aren't the best. It's only got 20-50 attack, which does outclass the level 6 ritual monsters, but doesn't outclass something like Crab Turtle, which is the level 8 ritual monster in the format. And its defense is pretty decent as well at 2500, but I don't really think that this card is that good. It is a level 7, which means that you can ritual summon it out using something like a Sangan and like a Senju or a Sonic Bird, which does sort of give it a little bit of utility, I guess. But I just think this card is not really worth playing. I think that the ritual strategies outside of Relinquished just are pretty bad. But, you know, this is another tool for those strategies if they want to make use of it. For the last monster I want to talk about here, we've got Mystical Sheep number 1, and this is another fusion substitute sort of monster. Now, in terms of stats, I don't really think that this card is better to play than something like Goddess with the Third Eye, as that monster has 1200 attack where this one has 1150. But it is an Earth attribute fusion substitute, so I guess it can be brought out off of like Giant Rat, which maybe if you're playing a clown control deck, you bring it out off of Giant Rat, and then you can go into like Bakuri Box, I guess. But I don't really think that this card's good. It is an interesting inclusion to that sort of fusion substitute series of monsters, though. So it's nice in that regard. And it is better than Versago the Destroyer, which would be the dark target for the Clown Control deck. But I mean, I don't think the Clown Control deck really needs to go into Bakuri Box anyways, and I think that just sort of waters it down and makes it pretty bad. So I don't really think that this card is worth playing. It is interesting to talk about, though. Moving on to the spells, we've got a very interesting card here, Exile of the Wicked, which is just a spell card that destroys all Fiend monsters on the field. Now, the issue with this is that there aren't many Fiend monsters that you'd actually want to use this on. I mean, Sangan's a Fiend, so you can clear it that way, but then your opponent will get a search off the Sangan, so I don't really think that's that bad for your opponent. Summon Skull is also a Fiend, so like you could use it in that case as well if your opponent is playing Summon Skull. Although I feel like Summon Skull has really fallen out of favor, and I feel like you just use like a Fissure or some other form of removal on it instead. And then the last Fiend monster that I can really think about having an impact is like Giant Germ, which this could be useful against that, as your opponent will likely be able to bring out 2 Giant Germs. You can activate Exile the Wicked, clear both of them, and then get in without taking damage and also just depriving your opponent of 2 resources. So as an anti-Giant Germ tech, it can be kind of good, and as I'll get to later, Burn is extremely good in this format based on the testing that we've done. But I just think this card is not really worth including. I guess it could be a potential side deck card if you want to include it, and it could get better in later formats as Fiends increase in power. But I think it's just sort of like an interesting card to talk about, not really one worth playing. For another spell, we've got Soul of the Pure, which increases your life points by 800. This is just a worse Dianketo the Cure Master, and given that life point gain cards in general are not really that good right now, and Dianketo doesn't even see play, I don't really see why this would see play either. So, you know, it's not really worth playing unless you're already maxed out on Ketos, and then if you want more life point removal, I guess it can be okay, but I don't really think this card is worth it. The last card I want to talk about in Tournament Pack 2 that's a bit interesting is Call of the Grave. Now, Tournament Pack 1 had a trap card called White Hole, which was made to basically be the strict counter to Dark Hole, and Call of the Grave is the strict counter to Monster Reborn. It basically says when your opponent activates Monster Reborn, negate the effect of that Monster Reborn. It's a very simple card, I guess it can have use if you're worried about Monster Reborn messing up your strategy. But Monster Reborn is a limited card, so it's only at 1 copy. And honestly, you'd probably be better off playing something like Magic Jammer, which has more utility, even though it does cost you a little bit more. But those are all the cards in Tournament Pack 2 that actually do something unique or add tools to decks that have previously been featured in these formats. But honestly, I think the only one that will really see any impact on the format is Morphing Jar. And to show off what I mean about this card, let me just show you a potential build that you can make for the mill deck, and maybe you'll see why this card is so strong. So this is my sort of temporary build for the mill deck in this format. You know, these decks aren't really quite solidified yet, but this is probably the one that I'll be using in my videos. There's still a lot to explore in this format, but I think this deck is really killer right now, and is one of the best decks in the format. Morphing Jar just adds so much, being able to draw your opponent 5 cards deeper into their deck, and being able to recycle the Morphing Jar with something like a Spear Cretin is insanely powerful as well. Just getting 3 more monsters that you can recur with Spear Cretin and that can dig your opponent deeper into their deck is insanely strong for the mill strategy. And it's just, there's so many good Spear Cretin targets now, so many ways to search them off of the Sanyans and the Witches, and this deck is just insanely powerful. Morphing Jar is also incredibly nice because it can enable you to gain more resources yourself. For instance, if you set a bunch of back row and you're down to very few cards in hand, you can Morphing Jar to gain 5 new cards, increase your combo potential, and potentially draw into something like card destruction more easily. And that's part of why Morphing Jar is very powerful in a variety of decks this format. Or at least it would be if this deck didn't exist and was so prominent. Now, to be fair, you know, I'm just basing this off of initial testing. If this format actually does get played a lot more, then maybe Mill will sort of fall by the wayside, even though it is incredibly powerful, because it had a very bad matchup against another deck in this format that I'll talk about soon. But because Mill is so prevalent in this format, if other decks play Morphing Jar, then it just enables Mill to deck them out even faster. And so I don't really think it's that good in a lot of other decks because this deck is such a threat, which makes Mill an incredibly strong pick because it is able to abuse one of the most broken cards in the format very easily, at 3 copies no less. So I think Mill is incredibly strong. I'm not going to go through a strict card by card here because I'm planning on making a video or 2 about this deck, but I have been very careful in saying that while this deck is one of the best decks in the format, I don't actually think it's the best deck in the format. And that may seem really weird because the main change to this format was adding a super powerful mill tool. So why don't I think this deck is the best in the format? Well, the reason for that is there's a deck that has an incredibly good matchup against it that Mill basically can't win against. And knowing the prevalence of Mill in this format, that deck can sort of preside against it. And that deck is Burn. Now, if you saw my last treasure format video, then you'll know that Burn and Mill have a very interesting matchup, and Burn can actually manage to beat Mill pretty effectively in treasure format if it's able to sort of set up its main burn combos with things like Chain Energy and Just Desserts and the like. However, in Jar format, since Mill is so strong, Burn can get even more brutally effective against Mill by pre-siding in Minars in the main deck. Now, Minar is a very interesting card. When it's discarded directly from your hand to the graveyard by the effect of a card your opponent controls, it inflicts 1,000 points of damage to your opponent's life points, which basically means that if your opponent is trying to mill you out through things like Morphing Jar and card destruction and the like, then these Minars can deal 3,000 damage to your opponent, which means that as the burn deck, you've only got to do 5,000. And that's honestly not that hard to do in a deck like this. This gives Burn an incredibly good matchup against Mill. And the matchup is so good, honestly, I think honestly you could potentially just keep the Minars in the side deck for if you're facing Mill, because just even bringing them in, Mill just has no real way around them once they're in the deck. So I think that Burn is honestly the best deck in this format because it has such a good Mill matchup, and pretty much every other deck has such a bad Mill matchup. So again, just like with Mill, I'm not really going to go through a strict card by card sort of analysis here. I'm planning on making a video about this deck in the future, so I'll go into it there a bit. But realistically, you know, there are some decks that can stand against Burn, so this definitely isn't a tier 0 format with Burn at the top. but those decks have a terrible matchup against Mill. Let's discuss the main one of those anyways, as it is pretty important given that this format is kind of like a very weird triangle format. So I do think that the Good Stuff deck has a decent burn matchup. You know, this probably isn't the optimal form of the Good Stuff deck. This is just a sort of version that I adapted from my Treasure format version of the Good Stuff deck. But I do think that it has a pretty decent burn matchup. Just being able to get aggressive with Mechanical Chasers, having enough spell and trap removal to potentially clear away your opponent's chain energies and the like. This can win games against Burn. Of course, Burn can win games against it. In Treasure format, both Good Stuff and Burn were in the same tier 1 status. But I do think that this deck has a terrible matchup against Mill, which really hurts its chances to be a major contender in this format. Mill is just so strong against decks that are just trying to deal battle damage because it has so many ways to sort of prevent your opponent from getting in and decking your opponent out. So I think that this is sort of one vertex of a very strange triangle of the top 3 decks. And I call it a triangle because this is an idea in later formats where basically you have 3 decks that, you know, they have good matchups against one side of the triangle, but they have a bad matchup against another side of the triangle. And I think you've kind of got that in this format, but instead of being a pure triangle, we have Mill very easily beats this sort of Good Stuff aggro deck, Burn very easily beats Mill, and then Burn and the Good Stuff aggro deck, they don't really have a clear winner. It's more just like a toss-up between the two. If Burn can get its like chain energies and things like that online early, then aggro will have a pretty tough time. But if Burn doesn't draw a lot of its powerful Burn cards, then aggro should be pretty good. So I definitely don't think this is a tier 0 format, but I think that in terms of like the meta game, it is very weird and interesting. Where, like, you know, you could play Good Stuff if you don't like the Burn or Mill strategies. But, like, if someone is playing Mill, despite its bad Burn matchup, you're just going to instantly lose. But that person who is playing Mill will just instantly lose against any Burn deck. So it's very strange. And, again, this is just based on preliminary testing in this format. You know, we don't have a huge sample size for the number of duels that we've played here. But this is just how it looks like the format is shaping out based on those preliminary results. And if this sort of guide has piqued your interest in the format, then check out the Discord server down below. We will be happy to have you and happy to have you explore this format with us, as there are many sort of very interesting optimizations that can be done with each of these decks in my opinion. But I probably won't spend too much time in Jar format given its similarities to Treasure format. I'll probably just show off the power of the Mill deck and the power of the Burn deck against that, and also maybe show off a sort of aggro versus Burn match as well. But let me know what you all want to see from this format down in the comments down below. And also let me know your thoughts on this format. Do you think that this format is just completely degenerate because like Burn and Mill are so good? Or do you think that the weird sort of triangle provides a very interesting dynamic for it that was absent in something like Treasure? Let me know all this down in the comments below. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.